In the case of the Foundry, this is definitely the people's core of North America. I mean that in terms of this is the demographic core, this is the historical core, the economic core, manufacturing core, demographic migration core. And so we look at this particular area is so much based on the role of humans over time settling, claiming this area as it evolves. So let's use the dot map, the people map, to explore the different areas that we'll be looking at. So we'll look at 3 particular areas. Now this is, in general, the Foundry as defined in the 9 nations of North America. So this is useful, but I'd say it's 3 different areas that kind of overlap with each other, that really describe what they're trying to say is the Foundry, the core, the demographic, population, economic core of North America. And so we'll begin with the megalopolis. The megalopolis is the Boss-Wash megalopolis, which I've already talked about Boston in terms of New England, but you could say the Boss-Wash, or Boston also is part of this conglomerate of urban areas that comprise the Northeast Atlantic coast. And so these are 5 different urban areas: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., that all evolved rather differently, and they all have kind of their individual quirks and their individual differences beyond different sports teams. But over time, as these different urban areas grew, they pretty much coalesced to form one cohesive urban network of suburban areas that blend over into other suburban areas of other metropolitan areas. So inside this blue line is what I call the megalopolis. Definitely the financial core, industrial core, not so much, but this is definitely where finance, banking, government, tertiary sector jobs have dominated. Now, there is some manufacturing and some industry, no doubt about it, but when we look at where manufacturing and industry is, that's going to be more found there in the Rust Belt. So the Rust Belt, I once gave a stuffy academic talk once, and this person in the back row with a British accent and one of those coats with leather patches on the elbows raised their hand and said, "Oh, young man, it's a pejorative term to use Rust Belt." I don't even know what pejorative means, but they said I should use the term decaying industrial American heartland. I say we just use the Rust Belt since that's what most people use, but it's inside this rust-colored line, and what we have is what is also referred to as the Midwest, but this is still an area of heavy manufacturing, heavy in terms of it's heavily concentrated here. A large percentage of jobs are in the secondary sector. And so this kind of skips, from the megalopolis, kind of skips the Appalachians. But this another characteristic is this pretty much an urban area. I mean, there's rural areas throughout Indiana, rural areas throughout Ohio and Michigan, and so on. But this does contain a lot of urban areas, like Indianapolis, like Anderson, like Kokomo. So it's more than maybe what is perceived as being flyover country by those there on the coast. Also, the Rust Belt does overlap, as you can see, with Canada. And so the Rust Belt, this is also Canada's Rust Belt, you could say. And so manufacturing has left this particular area as well. And so it's the decaying Canadian industrial heartland as well. But like I said, manufacturing is still very important in the Rust Belt. Also, I would go ahead and include the Rust Belt. I'd go ahead and include Iowa and Illinois. Iowa used to manufacture a lot of large appliances, Maytag, or washers and dryers. Whirlpool were headquartered there in Iowa. And so manufacturing huge appliances. Now, no longer is that the case. And so there's a lot of similarities you'd find in Iowa, where they're overwhelmingly dependent on manufacturing of appliances, as you would find in Gary, where they're overly dependent on steel, or Detroit, where they're overly dependent on automobiles. Finally, the last area is the Canadian corridor. And so it's called the Canadian Corridor kind of because of its shape, but it pretty much just includes what we previously discussed in the Quebec chapter as Upper Canada and Lower Canada. And so Lower Canada, we called that Quebec, and it does include that in the Canadian Corridor. It's called the corridor because core, the economic core, industrial core, this is a lot of the historical core of Canada as well. So this is going to be mostly what we're going to focus in this chapter because we've already talked about the Canadians, or the Quebec Quebec and Quebecois, Montreal, Quebec City, the eastern townships, and all of that. So we're just going to focus on Ottawa, the capital of Canada, but mostly Toronto and the surrounding areas that comprise southern Ontario.